Hello, dear audience. We are together and we are going to continue the conversation that we started last time, the conversation on love. Love, as we mentioned last time, is the crown of all the virtues. And even St. Paul puts it separately and says that this is the top of all virtues that a human being can have. And if we have all the virtues, but not this one, we are nothing. And so Presbyteria Kiyaki and I will continue our conversation because last time we gave a general idea what the love is, but we will try to go into more details today and try to reveal this universal and eternal quality that a human being has. Last week I was watching programs about universe, and that made me feel very small to the extent that I was losing the value of human being or the planet Earth, because you realize that you're almost nothing comparing our persons with the universe. But at 1 second, in the middle of this, I had to wake up and realize that I'm alive, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, I love, I hope, I have faith, I have relationship with people, I'm moving, and there has to be something in between. And the small things themselves are great. This is a phenomenon. Love is one of those qualities that we have, and it makes us great. It makes us as big as the universe because we can hold that type of quality. Welcome, Presbytera. Thank you for coming to give some more deeper knowledge about love. I understand that it's impossible to cover the love because it is universal, it's as big as the universe, and it dwells in our hearts, and it's in between all the people who relate to each other. And I want to remember one saying that one of the Armenian poets has used, saying that the opposite of love is not hate, it's death. As long as we live, we have love. That's how I understand it. So we should go into more details if possible.
You said many things just now, Arkady, as we get started. Mm-hmm. When you were talking about sitting in front of the television and being made to feel overwhelmed, almost inconsequential to the whole universe, that the universe is infinite, and who am I? And it almost felt crushing as you were talking about that. It made me think of many things. It made me think of similar times I was either reading or watching something and feeling sort of infinitely tiny and insignificant, to other examples of feeling insignificant in relationship with people, not just reading or seeing something on television, but somehow being made to feel less than myself, less of a person, less with a desire to live. And so that this Armenian poet talked about the opposite of love being death, I have a sense of why he said that when we are in relationships with others, and they are not based in love, in what is love from a Christian perspective, it is our abiding in the presence of the living God, who is love. And so each word can be defined with an encyclopedia, and we can talk more about that as our weeks go on together, if that is God's will, that we keep our conversations going. But our abiding in the presence of the living God, thrice holy, as we abide, as we dwell in the presence, in the love of the living God, who is love, who personifies love, who is the creator of love, who is love even beyond our understanding of creation, is in a sense urging us, begging us to turn our attention in that way so that we too can be filled with and be givers of this love. I know it's kind of a big sort of running thought, but that's what you shared with me. Bottom line, everybody matters. Bottom line, everything matters. Every tiny thing matters. We talked about last time about some people we knew who had lost their child. And even though they were loving people, beforehand, after the loss of their child, and through the trauma and through the angst and through the incredulousness that they went through in what does it mean to go on without this child. And we know of people, and I'm sure people in our audience know of others who've experienced far more than just one trauma like this, but any trauma is horrifically catastrophic to the psyche when it's experienced as trauma. As they worked through this pain, became even more loving, to the point where they did not want to kill mosquitoes, they did not want to kill spiders because everything mattered. Well, in a way we don't understand as humans, everything in creation matters to the loving God. Every person infinitely matters. We don't understand what that means in our minds, but each person matters in an infinite way to the love of the living God. Everything matters in ways we don't understand. Every dust particle matters in ways we don't understand. Mm-hmm. And so we live in a society, since the fall of Adam and Eve, by the way, but I think in our society, because of so many toys and so many distractions and so many temptations and so many ways to have our energies sort of split into many, many directions. And I'm accused often of multitasking too much. So I have to be careful that these kinds of distractions take our attention away from what is authentic, what is real, which is the love of the living God, and loving God and one another in His presence.
Because you mentioned about God being love, being creator of love, and also we, as you mentioned again, talked about a loss that has caused a lot of pain. Why does God allow being love completely and being creator of love, loving every single particle of the universe? And then we see people suffering, people experiencing loss that matters to them.
That's an enormous question. Let me share some thoughts. To say I know for sure means to make myself equal with God, right? But at the same time, this is part of the Christian audacity. God, in His infinite love for each one of us, wants to love us as if we were equals in a creaturely way. We are creatures, but He wants to love us in that way. He wants us in love to become His friends. As an ancient Christian term in Greek, He wants us to become philothei, friends of God. Mm. And so all of love, if love is authentic, even from before time, from before creation, where God existed, whatever existence means, before creation ever occurred, was indwelling amongst Himself in a relationship of love. Because as Christians, we believe there's one God, and yet there are three persons. And so what does that mean? Three persons and one God? 1 and 1 and 1 equals 1? Yes, it doesn't make sense mathematically, but that this God lived in love even before creation existed. And so love is one of free choice. Love is where we open ourselves up at the risk of risking everything for the sake of offering to the other, mindfully, with our eyes open, and in a sense, in a divine way, in a mysterious way. We don't understand that this was happening within the Trinity. We are called in a creaturely way to that love. And so you asked, for example, life is filled with tragedy, life is filled with pain, life is filled with non-love or anti-love. Yes, life is that way. And we have to be very careful. We can be very comfortable in our lives and live most of the context of our lives out and really not know what authentic love is. We may have whiffs of some of it, but we don't really experience authentic love because we do not surrender to the other in a way that opens us up to the divine and our own selves in a way that for which we were created. Mm-hmm. Please ask me questions, because I know this is going to sound really erudite to many people, but this is also based out of practical work as well.
I remember one example that I believe Metropolitan Anthony is bringing, and he says when the priest goes to a family where there has been a loss of a child and tries to comfort them, sometimes they make a mistake and say, well, I understand how hard it is. And most of the time the answer has been, no, you don't understand. You cannot understand because you are not the one who had the loss. So it's really edgy to answer this type of question, but still I would like to go further, comparing this to the suffering of the saints. Because suffering is part of the life, so we have to deal with it anyways. We want it or not, it's present. But how do the saints, holy people, deal with it? And how do the regular people like us deal with it? I know that some of them chose suffering for God's love. They wanted to reject every kind of joy just because they wanted to give everything to God. Do you have any comments on this type of acceptance of suffering? Should people try to accept their suffering and find joy in God?
So let me look at that, what you just said, from another angle.
Mm-hmm.
I think a simpler way to say that would be, you have to help me with this, is we just have to live our lives. What does that mean? We live our lives without looking for suffering, because suffering will find us. If we're living well, if we're doing a good job, suffering will find us. So if we try to create suffering or try to create some kind of spiritual discomfort intentionally as an end in itself, not necessarily as a way to please God.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's a subtle difference, but as an end in itself, we're wasting our own and especially God's time. But by just living our lives, think of the story Jesus said about the Good Samaritan. And he starts the story by saying a man was beaten up and left for dead on the road. And first came a priest, and then came a Levite, and each, implying they were in a hurry, probably going to some kind of religious event or some kind of important event, and ignored the person and kept going. And that the third party that came along was a Samaritan, someone who was known to be a group of people that was in enmity with Israel, and that Israel at that time looked at the Samaritans as half-breeds, so to speak. And so there was contempt of race, there was contempt of religious practice, because they were Jews at one time who had intermarried and had picked up some of the customs of the people with whom they had intermarried. And so there were many layers of contempt and animosity toward each group. And so Jesus says that the person who expressed the will of God, which was an act of love, was a Samaritan who helped heal this person and took him to an inn for more healing, and from his own pocket left him with invested in his care. And so this is what love looks like. It means in your path, who is the other that God brings to you? Who is that stranger that God brings on your path that needs your attention, even if it means to change your day?
In that relationship, that love is expressed towards neighbor who is a stranger, basically, that's how Jesus expresses and shows the best love. He shows what is the best love. On the other hand, when we see that the Christian monastics run away from world, they don't want to deal with people. Now I remember when I was the first year of the seminary, the previous patriarch of Armenia, the blessed memory, was giving lectures to us, and he said that love is not one way from God to person or from person to God. It's a triangle. It has to be in between two people, and that can go to God. So this is contradicting to each other. What the patriarch said matches with the fact that Jesus said you have to be nice to your friend, to your neighbor, and that way you please God. But on the other hand, side we see that the monastics run away. They reject everything in the world. They don't want to
Well,
walk.
they were discerning for themselves that the big cities or even the big towns or regular society was not the venue to which they were called to live a life that was pleasing to God.
Mhm.
And so for them, they went into the desert, and sometimes they lived in small monastic communities, which were called synobetic. Sometimes they were even smaller monastic families called semi-synobetic. And other times they would be sort of hermits living in the wilds, and that would be like an idiorhythmic, sort of a style of its own kind of style of monasticism. Meaning these are various ways people followed God, they grew in God. There's lots of ways to grow in God, but even if you read, and I know you have, if you read the ascetics from all these centuries, and be they in the deserts of Nitria or in the forests of Russia, that all of them, wherever they were in their context, had to deal with their own life in the presence of God and the neighbor that happened to come across their path. Sometimes someone would knock on their little door. Sometimes they would be, while searching for food, bumping into other people. And so even in the deserts, even in the forests, the same call of love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself, they were still accountable to. One of the important dimensions of this with monastic spirituality is that of hospitality, and to other monastics and pilgrims coming through the area. And so this is another way of them being open to the other that comes their way. And so it's not necessarily a different set of directives that the Lord calls us to. It's a different venue, a different context, but still the same call. I'm helping with another book that St. Catherine's Vision is writing on the life of women saints. And one of the, in our next volume, which should come out sometime in the spring, I hope, of 2010.
We should make a little presentation about it.
That would be good. I'd like that. But one of the chapters will be dedicated to contemporary issues, as well as the life of Saint Juliana the Merciful, who was a married woman who lived in the 18th century in Russia. She was married to one man, and they had 13 children together. And of the 13, 6 died. And in her grief, she wanted to leave her husband and the other 7 and go to a monastery. She just could not handle the grief. And he was a wealthy gentleman and had means to provide for the family, but he begged her to stay.
So one second, I want to make something clear. The children usually in the big families die because of poverty, because of sickness, but you mentioned that they were wealthy.
Relatively wealthy. So, but even then, sickness occurs. We're talking a couple of 100 years ago, 200-300 years ago. Types of plagues would occur, and so the author, I will give the credit to the author of this chapter. Her name is Susan Arida, from here in the Boston area. In her research, found that she was so distraught that she just couldn't bear staying at home anymore. And her husband, even though the tradition of the day in Russia was to be more power-oriented and keep your wife and children in command and in control, instead of trying to command her, instead of trying to order her to just sort of suck it up, so to speak, begged her to stay and would read the scriptures to her and would read lives to try to inspire her, lives from saints who also went through hardship, to stay. And to make a long story short, she stayed. He was away on business many times, and she would manage the household, which was unusual for that culture at the time. And when he passed away, used the wealth that they had to provide for the poor, because at that time Russia started to go through famine that went for at least a couple of decades. And she and her surviving children did what they could to provide for the poor. She never said no to anyone, even if, and this is what Susan Arida was wondering, sometimes even if people may have had food to eat, she never refused anyone in trying to give, to the point where when she had given everything she had, she was even able to bake bread from pigweed, which was growing wild in their area, and a few other ingredients to help the poor survive the famine. She's been canonized in the life of the church, and she's known as the Merciful. She, who wanted at one point to enter a monastery just to be with God and to and perhaps grieve and ask His mercy alone, lived her life instead with the help of her husband. She just showed up for her life. And so that's not an easy thing sometimes, but she did much good as a result of that.
Since you described this lady that was called Merciful, and the main characteristic of her is to help the poor, I want to tell another story and make a little connection here. Metropolitan Anthony tells about his teacher, that this was in France when he was a little kid going to school. And he said that every day when they were walking on the school path to go to the school, there was this beggar sitting on the side of the road. And his teacher was walking in front of the group of kids that he was in. And they saw how he came close to that beggar, stood in front of him, took his hat off, and looked at him. And then the beggar stood up. They gave each other a hug, and he continued going. He says that this gentleman, this teacher, was a very quiet person. He didn't like to talk, but when they got to the school, the children gave him a hard time and made him explain what did he do. So he explained and said that because he didn't have money in his pocket, he didn't take the train. He walked all the way from home, and when he got to the beggar, he felt like he has to do something for him. And he didn't have anything to give. And he stopped by and he looked at him, took his hat off to show respect, that he respects the person, and told him that he doesn't have money and he's very sorry not to be able to help him. But he feels that they are almost in the same position. And they said, why did he give you a hug? And the explanation was that when their eyes met, that person's eyes were lighten up. And he stood up and he said, I have been sitting on the side of this road for a long time. Many people have passed by, they have given me money, but I have never met a person who gives me as much of a value that you did. I feel the richest at this point because you look at me as an equal. So this is the other side of the coin. What you explained about the lady, merciful lady, who gave everything that she had, even went to make food for the... And on the other hand, this person doesn't have anything, but has something to give. Would you make some connections and comments on this?
Authentic mercy has to be loving. It is what you're saying in between the lines is there is a possibility to give, even to give generously in a philanthropic way, and do good, and not love. Mm-hmm. Now, St. Juliana obviously was a person of love, and hopefully when you read the chapter and other people read Susan Arita's chapter, you'll agree with me what an incredibly loving person she was. At the same time, we all know of people who will just write the check, or write a small check, a token check, to get people off their backs, and not engage those whom are asking our help as equals. Mm-hmm. And so this is a life-changing way of living. To look at every person, love your neighbor as you love yourself. We've talked in the past about healthy love for self, not love of self, which is idolatry, but love for self. Well, as we are striving to grow in love for self, the kind of love that God wants His sons and daughters to grow in, it also means that we treat, or are striving to treat, everyone who crosses our path according to that realization, according to that truth. Now, that's going to be different all the time. Sometimes, I'm not saying to put ourselves in physical danger. That might happen. Maybe there might come a time we have to do that. But I'm not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that we have to start taking more risks with the stranger, with the other. The Greek word for stranger and the Greek word for visitor is the same one, xenos, or xenos. The Greek word for our neighbor, as we said before in a previous visit of our episodes, is the word plesion, or plesion, which means that person, whoever that may be, that stranger who just happens to be next to you, not necessarily your geographical neighbor who lives in the next condominium or apartment or house, but whoever that stranger is that happens to show up next to you. And so all of these persons crossing our path are created in the image and likeness of God, and they matter. Do we really approach everyone we bump into in our lives as if they matter?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's almost like the story that Jesus tells about the old lady that gave her last coin, and the other person who was richer gave way more than she did, but didn't count because he was giving the extra that he had.
It means crossing groups. You and I might be very comfortable because we know each other. We have a lot of contacts from the same Christian community. And that's good. And even then that's hard because we don't agree with everyone, and not everybody is in our community that may be living in the same way we would be comfortable with. And so imagine how much more difficult it is to look at everyone we encounter at the supermarket, as we go and get our cars filled with gas. That all of the places where we do business, where our paths cross people from various ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, social backgrounds, who come and who are carrying their own cross in life. I'm finding that I'm accountable to all of them in some way. How? I don't know. But I'd rather feel that loss and that pain than to pretend everything's all right.
Mm-hmm. Now when you were explaining that, I had this image in front of my eyes. They say that the deserts are the shame of the humanity on the planet. Meaning that at one point at a time, they have been covered with forests, and now we have pushed it so far that they have become they're deserts, and they're like open wounds on the planet Earth. And in the same time, the poverty that occurs on different parts of the planet, I imagine the same way is the shame of the humanity, and it speaks about the loss of love. Because if we look at the statistics, there is enough food for everybody on this planet. There is enough wealth to provide for everyone, but yet the great majority of humanity is in extreme poverty. But what can be done? Now, when you were saying about every single person that we meet we love, do you think that that's where it should start and it will expand by itself? If I love my neighbor and somebody in a gas station, somebody in a supermarket, and this wave will start going to the places where there's poverty. I don't necessarily need to write a check and send to a country in Africa, and I don't know what happened to that check, but instead every second to be in love. If I need to write a check, I will write at this moment. If I need to do something else with love, maybe that's what I should do.
I agree with your observation.
Mm-hmm.
What you're also talking about is spiritual poverty. And I think one reason why we are in such disarray on the planet, as I would say theologically since Adam and Eve, but now it's like speeding up from my observation, is that human beings are failing to acknowledge their inner spiritual poverty. And what does that mean? When Jesus in Matthew, the book of Matthew, and you'll also find it in the book of Luke. It talks in terms of the Beatitudes. Blessed is,
Yes.
okay, happy is, it depends on the translation. The first Beatitude is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. And so what does that mean? And we mentioned this in a previous episode, but maybe we can talk about this from another angle right now. The poor in spirit refers to the people in Greek who are phtochi, the phtochos. The phtochos refers to not, which in English is translated as poor, but it's not the poor that most of us in our society think of, the working class poor, or the barely making it poor. The phtochi, the poor that Jesus is talking about, are those who are the untouchables, let's say in the Indian caste society, the Dalits, those people who don't even have any status. They are completely invisible in the life of the community. And so these are this is the kind of poverty that Jesus is pointing to, that we are all spiritual Dalits. We are all completely, utterly bankrupt in the sense that we are created out of nothing, or after nothing, to be a little bit more correct theologically from an Orthodox perspective. And so we are basically pieces of dust, specks of clay, created in the image and likeness of God. That's an amazing phenomenon. But we have to claim the truth that we are basically specks of dust. And so that's claiming our finiteness, our poverty, our spiritual poverty. We did not create ourselves. And so we align ourselves with truth by acknowledging and operating out of that assumption that we are specks of dust created in the image and likeness of God, claiming that poverty. For us to be able to proceed with the rest of the Beatitudes, it all starts with acknowledging and operating out of that being poor in spirit. It's interesting, it's very interesting when we look at a lot of the recovery movements. What is the first step toward healing? The first step is acknowledging their powerlessness over whatever it is that's ailing them. So there's an insight here that goes back many centuries about what it means to be human. To be human means to align ourselves with our finiteness. So for us to be able to be receivers of love, and so that we are also able to somehow be humble conduits of love. We are most authentic, most right-sized when we do that empty-handed and open-handed with our eyes wide open in the presence of God. What does that do to us? When we operate this way, when we live a life based in surrender, that we are not God, that God is God, and everything is a gift, we do two things. We live in a way where we are humble. We have to be humble because humility is being right-sized in the presence of God. Well, then, I'm not God, so God's God, so there's that humility. Sometimes humility means to be smaller than others around us who might be puffed up with grandiosity. Sometimes humility means standing up to the plate, like David did with Goliath, saying no to some kind of injustice when the time is right. Saint Cassiani, you've been very kind, I've shared this before, a 9th century Byzantine saint, abbess of a monastery, is known to have said, now she may have said this or someone close to her said this and put it in her mouth, but is known to have said, I despise silence when it is time to speak.
Yes.
And so that too, stepping up to the plate, can also be humility. But there's a third dimension of humility that we sometimes mention, that we don't mention, that I forget, and that is because we need humility is the ground out of which love occurs. Authentic love is based on that surrender, so that we can be right-sized and discerning. And so, but when we are humble, when we are, the third factor about humility is suppleness. That we are supple, that we are cultivating our hearts so that it become more hearts of flesh, or the kind of flesh that God wants to be beating in our hearts. Not hearts of stone or hearts of lead, like we once told a story here on this program several weeks ago. And so that suppleness is very important for love. And we don't have to know what the consequences are of that, of expressing that love or being open to that love or that loving sacrifice. Even that has to be surrendered.
Mhm. You made a very good explanation. I'm impressed, and I have several questions. When you mentioned about the humanity being spiritually poor,
Right.
and not recognizing that poverty,
Right.
and Christ talking about the poor who will inherit the kingdom of heaven, who are spiritually poor. Now, can we say that our spiritual journey starts from recognition of our poverty? This is what I'm getting out of your explanation. That when we recognize our poverty in spirituality, that's when we start, and based on our humility, we also have love.
Let me interrupt you. It depends. For some of us, some of the time, it will be recognizing our inner poverty. That will be a gift. For others, it might be the awareness, more giving or receiving of a love that is far bigger than we are, that gives life, not in a kind of life that is titillating or like a high.
Mm-hmm.
That can be very difficult to tell. Is that real life when someone is titillated or high on excitement or high on anything, versus the kind of experience of being more alive and drinking in whatever this experience of love is. Love is a mystery. For me to be able to say what that feels like, I can only say, I can maybe describe it for myself. I cannot say what that feels like for you, I think, but my sense it would be similar. And sometimes love is doing the right thing and not feeling anything.
Yes.
But when we are experiencing love, there might come an opportunity when we are sidewinded by something and we're caught off guard and we are overwhelmed with the love of God, or some kind of love that points us to a love bigger than ourselves, which points to love, which points to truth. But to receive that also sort of naturally as a secondary expression invites us to be aware of our own finiteness, our own poverty. When we are contained in the love of God, when we allow ourselves to be held by the love of God, we experience our own finiteness and poverty, and we rejoice even more because it's God's loving hands that are holding us up under our little bit of existence. Now, how am I saying all this? Well, I don't know. But a lot of this is what I'm doing the best I can for my own study, for my own work with people, to share what I've come to know.
In our everyday life, we worry about our bank account, our gas tank, our cupboards in the kitchen. So our refrigerators, they're all full. Has to be at least maintained on daily basis, otherwise. And if they are not, to the extreme extent, the human being will slowly go to death. If we don't have money, we don't have food, we don't have this, physically we'll end up dying. But we don't pay attention to our spiritual poverty. Thomas à Kempis says, every time I relate with people, I come out as a less of a person myself. From monastic perspective, he suggests to withdraw from humanity and connect only with God to be a better person. But this also shows that every day in our daily life, involved in our daily life, we get less and less and less, and poorer and poorer and poorer, and we don't pay attention that the gauge of our spiritual gas tank is showing zero. And I want to connect this with the sentence that Christ told to his disciples. One of them, I don't exactly remember, I think it was Peter or another one, who said that he wants to go bury his father or mother or relative, and he said, let the dead bury their dead. This is kind of absurd. How can a dead person bury a dead person? But what I understand is that there are people who are physically alive, walking, but he referred this kind of people who did not have any spiritual juice left in them, that were dead spiritually. Let them take care of the...
But they didn't know they were dead.
Stuff.
You're right. That's a good
Yes.
story. That's a good example. They did not know they're dead. So just as today, we can have adequate food. We usually have more than adequate food, at least in many parts of North America right now. We can have adequate food. We can have adequate shelter, adequate clothing, and all these toys. And these are some of the things we've talked about from the beginning. These toys that are tools and they're important, but they can be distractions. And so our whole life, as I talked about myself a little while ago today, about it, I get teased for my multitasking. I do multitask a lot. I hope sometimes I surrender all that and get centered too. That I try to do that daily also, and which helps me multitask, by the way. But there comes a point when there's too much multitasking, and our attention gets dissipated, and it's like we're the dog chasing our own tail, not going in the direction we should be going, but rather it's all about our own sense of sensibilities and the definition of our universe, or falling victim to somebody else's definition of the universe, as that we are thinking will be giving us life when we are turning our backs on the author of life. And so let the dead bury their own dead. Sure, it's really easy for me in our society today to spend the whole day worried about all kinds of things. And from the latest sale, may I add, which I am also vulnerable to succumbing toward, to the next work project I have to do. They can take on a life of their own that in the long run take us away from life, capital L, the life in Christ, the life that God is calling us to. And so the same movement today, which might be life-giving, tomorrow might not be life-giving because it's taking us in a new direction.
Yes, and the other thing that Christ talks about is that we can live not only by the bread.
Right.
When they speak about the hungry people following, he says he pitied them and said that they not only with the physical bread we live. And so love in this sense, I don't want the audience to think that we went away from the topic of love, but originally my question was going to be, is the love that gauge that shows us that we are spiritually empty when we don't have patience with somebody, when we don't love our neighbor, then we can tell that there is nothing left inside of us. We are all an empty shell that makes noise going around and banging here and there.
Well, that's why it's good that we as Christians believe that God is a merciful God who knows and experiences our limitations, because we believe God himself became human, and so knows from the inside out how hard it is to be human. And so if God was compassionate before, after the incarnation of Christ, after the second person, according to our understanding as Christians, after the second person of the Trinity became a human being and remained the second person of the Trinity, God, even in a more exquisite way, although I don't think God needed to do that, has become one with us, knowing what it's like to be human. So we've shared this example before, but it's such a beautiful example of Jesus feeling sad and lonely and tired. And he would say, the birds have their nests and foxes have their dens, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I think he felt that desire for love. He felt lonely. He felt tired. When we are being loved and exchanging love, we are usually energized. We are usually happy. We feel connected. And so even Jesus knew, and God in a new way, voluntarily knew from the inside out what it means to be feeling bereft. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, he felt bereft in ways humans don't understand, and that bereft not only that he felt rejected by the people that he loved, when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But he felt bereft of God's love himself, which is an astounding thing for him to express and for us as Christians to fathom. And so that for love himself to experience this non-love is a testimony to love.
Yes. I would like to go to another stage and speak about the qualities of love and our growth in those qualities. Because we know that we love our pets, we love our kids, we love our relatives, our parents, our toys that we play with. We love our nation, the people in our village more than in our nation, the next neighbor town, and this expands. But to some point, it has to come to a universal love. I would like to go to that, but we're running out of time. So I'll bring one more example, which will lead to this, where Christ says, whoever loves his parents, his father and mother, more than me is not worthy of me. So how do you understand that? And is he directing his question to a sort of life, to love, to a level of type of love that is not acceptable? Because a person who has divine love, that love will spread to everyone, no matter who that person or people are, or it's directed to God, to people, but he specifies whoever loves his parents more than me, meaning it's a narrow, very concentrated, directed love that is not acceptable from him.
There's many levels, again, here. And when you talk about Jesus in this example from the Gospels, we also, as Christians, as traditional Christians, we believe that Jesus is also God. And so he is also saying, whoever loves any human being, including mother or father more than me, is not deserving of me. In other words, is not living life authentically, is not being true to themselves in the presence of God. And so to love father or mother more than God is to, in a sense, talk about idolatry. It's making one's ethnic or familial ancestry God. And so we have to think about that. What does that mean to place the expectations of our own family or our own tribe?
Mm-hmm.
And we can think about what does tribe mean today for us. But and I think we all live within various circles of tribes. And so not that God broke up all the tribes, but what are the priorities out of which we live? In that, in the end, it's not about the tribe. If living in a tribe, coming from a tribe helps us become more ourselves, helps us gain qualities as a person that helps us offer ourselves to others, that's wonderful. But when the tribe becomes God and takes us away from our neighbor, that would be antithetical to love. And so love takes us past tribe. Love takes us past blood relations. Love takes us past socioeconomic ghettos. It changes us all from the outside in and the inside out. And so I try to live by whatever Christian directives I can ascertain through my life in the church. And so putting any tribe above the love of God is antithetical to love. Now we have to think about, Christ died for the life of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it's God's definition of the world, not any fallen nation or any fallen market-driven definition of what the world is about. I think we should be very suspicious about who defines what the world is.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time right now, but we will continue. We have lots more questions here to answer. Thank you very much again, and thank you, dear audience. Be with us. And if things that haven't been cleared yet for you, we will try to give more explanations during our next topic. But keep in mind that this is not going to give answers to all the questions that exist about love, because, as we mentioned in the beginning, it's eternal, it's universal, it's endless. Thank you again, and see you next time.